Hi. This is Modwave from Korg. And it can do this. And this. And this. And a lot more, which I'll play at the end of this video. Modwave is the third synth in this form factor, this time with a focus on wavetable synthesis, but it can also play samples from a built-in 2 gig library. Aside from that, it also has a unique take on the concept of an XY pad called Kaoss Physics, an interesting generative style motion sequencer, and a fairly gigantic mod matrix. In this video, I'll take an in-depth look at all of its features, including pros and cons, and play you a bunch of its presets at the end. Before I start, a quick disclosure. Korg sent Modwave over for review, but as always, they have no say over the content of this video, except for one thing. They asked me to mention that availability will be around fall 2021. But other than that, as always, reviews are never paid. This channel is funded by viewers who subscribe to my content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and store affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Let's start with an overview. Modwave is probably more similar to the Korg Wavestate than Op6, which is a very different beast. The overall workflow, filter section, envelopes, LFOs, and effects are almost the same. There's also a big overlap in the built-in sample library. The big differences are in the oscillator section. Wavestate's sequencer lane controls have been made shift functions on the sequencer on the bottom right. You can no longer swap samples for each sequence step like on the Wavestate, and instead you've got detailed oscillator controls over here. Whereas Wavestate lets you move from sample to full sample in the sequencer, Modwave moves through single cycle waveforms in a wavetable regardless of the sequencer. The Wavestate can sort of do that if you place single cycle waveforms in each step of its sequencer steps, but it's not really designed to be a wavetable synth like Modwave is, as you'll see in a bit. Modwave is also almost fully bi-timbral. You can split its layers across the keyboard or layer them, including different velocity layers, and you have different layer effects for each of the timbres. Modwave has 32 voice polyphony in total, which is shared between the two layers, as are the master, reverb, and EQ effects, the Kaoss physics controls, and the mod knobs or macro knobs. Modwave supports smooth transitions between presets for most of the presets. Not always. In terms of voice structure, each voice in a layer has 2 oscillators with simple cross mod options between the two, including FM and a third sub-oscillator / noise generator. Each of the 2 oscillators can be either in wavetable mode, which is either A or A and B for 2 wavetables per oscillator, or in sample playback mode, in which case it can play back multi-samples. Multi-samples are sample files that include multiple samples, as opposed to using a single sample for the entire keyboard range, which typically doesn't sound good, especially for acoustic instruments. Modwave comes with 2 gigabytes of library samples, both natural sounding samples and over 200 wavetables, which sound like this or like these, but it's also capable of more traditional synth style sounds. Aside from the oscillators, Modwave has multiple filter emulators, 4 envelopes, 5 LFOs, we spoke about layer effects and the reverb earlier, and a motion sequencer. Korg calls this motion sequencing 2.0. You've got 7 lanes, and it's 2.0 because each lane can have different lengths and can play in different directions. 3 lanes are fixed, timing, pitch, and shape, which is an envelope per step, and then 4 lanes can sequence values and send those anywhere you want. Each lane can have up to 64 steps. Speaking of modulations, you won't be short of mod slots in the mod matrix or mod destinations here. For example, aside from the usual suspects, you can modulate the value of individual steps in the sequencer, which brings up the interesting possibility of sequences writing themselves. Moving on with the overview, the Kaoss physics pad replaces a joystick and vector envelope in Wavestate with a unique physics-based element, meaning that as opposed to a regular 2D XY pad, you can curve the 2D surface in a third dimension as well as control other elements of the surface, and then throw the XY spot around that surface as if it was a ball, which will in turn interact with that 3D surface as if it was rolling on top of it. Back to the comparison to Wavestate, you can also move the XY spot around on Wavestate using the vector envelope, so you can move it on its own, but that's along a more predictable path, whereas here, the physics can introduce quite a bit of, well, chaos into the sound. Moving on, you've got the mod knobs, which are assignable to multiple destinations, and with a nice twist, you can rename them so that every time you bring up a performance, you can see on screen exactly what they do. This is useful for the factory presets as well as for your own. It's just nice to be able to see what each mod knob does. Finally, in terms of build, the top panel is made of metal, a little bit of a fingerprint magnet. The whole enclosure is plastic and overall very light. The keybed is full size but has a light action. It's velocity sensitive without aftertouch. In terms of connectivity, Modwave comes with a power supply, built-in MIDI in and out, USB for MIDI and control using the editor librarian. Control, by the way, works over a USB network. This generates with your computer and not over MIDI. There's a sustain pedal input, 2 1/4-inch audio jacks, and a 1/4-inch stereo headphone output. Aside from everything on this synth, which we'll talk about in detail, Modwave also comes with an editor librarian software, which is well worth a mention. Hardware synths should obviously be viable standalone without a computer nearby, and Modwave is, but Modwave does so many things that the fact that this editor exists can help shorten the learning curve dramatically. The editor acts as a screen for Modwave, so all the parameters are in sync. For example, this is layer 1, and this is layer 2. And you can see the modulations move on screen for both layers, which is pretty neat. Most of Modwave's functions can be done pretty quickly on the panel itself, certainly faster than mousing around looking for a knob, but the software has a few advantages. For example, if we swap out a preset, then you'll see all the knob values change on screen, including modulation values that I mentioned earlier. Also, the sequencer view, at least currently, is better on the software. So you can go into sequencer view here by pressing Shift and sequencer view or double tapping this, and you'll see progress on a per lane basis, but you can't see the content of lanes, at least not currently over here, whereas you can see the content of lanes on the software. The software also has views for 16, 32, and 64 steps at a time. Over here, you can only see 16 steps at a time, and it's obviously easier to rename presets on a computer as opposed to moving around an alphabet using the encoder over here. And I think the software is also a much better way to learn the synth, sort of just to see what you get, what the different components are, to have a visual look across the board. But ultimately, I found myself gravitating towards using the hands-on synth controls, which is obviously the point of a hardware synth. So what does the workflow look like on the synth? Most of the knobs and buttons have 2 functions. The default function is labeled in white, and the secondary function, the shift function, is labeled in blue, and you can either hold shift and turn a knob or just double tap shift, hold it, and then move and change the secondary function. I wouldn't call Modwave menu divey, but I would call it page divey, meaning that if there are additional parameters that you can't access on the panel itself, you'll need to use these arrow keys to look around and find them. So these pages are always contextual based on the knob that you touch, and more often than not, you'll have more than one page associated with a specific function. For example, here you've got 4 pages. These 4 circles represent 4 pages, and you can page around using the shift and page forward and backwards. So yeah, I touched over here, 3 pages for the filter and 4 pages for the oscillators. So that's pretty much as shifty as it gets. You can also use the enter as sort of like a secondary shift function to check out the value of a parameter without changing it. So if I were to say touch this knob, I'd start changing this parameter, whereas if I held enter and touched it, I'd select the parameter without changing the parameter. It's also useful for the arpeggiator. So let's say that I turned it on and I moved on to something else and then wanted to edit the arpeggiator parameters. If I just hit that, it would stop, and that's what I would use enter for. So go to a different parameter, change that, edit the arpeggiator like that. So that's more or less the general user interface. Let's dive in a little bit deeper, and I'll start with the 3 things that make Modwave different from Wavestate, which is the oscillator section, the sequencer, and the Kaoss physics. I'll start with an init preset. Sawtooth, as you'd expect. Now, since Modwave is an all-digital synth, its Sawtooth really is just one of hundreds of waveforms that it has on board. A brief intro for those of you not familiar with wavetable synthesis. Traditional analog oscillators only create simple wave shapes, unless they modulate each other's frequency or pass them through wave shapers, but that's a different story. And you can do that here, but since these oscillators are digital, they can create any wave shape or timbre they like. These shapes are stored in wavetables, and you can morph through different shapes in Wavetable by moving the position knob. Now, this specific wavetable only has 4 shapes: saw, square, triangle, and sine. And by the way, we're crossfading between these shapes. I could turn crossfading off and literally move between the 4 shapes, but nobody wants that. Anyway, this particular wavetable called Basic 1 has 4 wave shapes, which are similar to analog style oscillators, but there's no reason to limit yourself to those. Let's maybe pick something else. You can see shapes that are quite different. And each wavetable basically tells its own kind of mini timbral story based on the idea that the person that made it had in mind. Now, you can actually create your own wavetables. So I sampled myself saying, this is a wavetable, where are you at? And imported that over here. I did this using Serum.
This is a wavetable. This is a wavetable.
Each wavetable can have up to 64 shapes. So you can see that each wave shape on its own isn't much. But when you scan through the wavetable using the position parameter, the picture comes together. So that, in a nutshell, basically is wavetable synthesis, but most wavetable synths also add a few more waveform manipulation functions into the mix, and Modwave is no different. The first waveform or wavetable mangling function is Morph, which lets you perform a bunch of gradual functions on a waveform. This algorithm is called Stretch, and as you can hear, drastically changes its timbre and feel. That sounds a bit threatening. And there are actually quite a few morph types. So this morph type is Stretch, and you can change morph type by holding Shift and turning this knob. Let's go, for example, to windowed sync, which is a nice one. This is a form of modified oscillator sync. There's also regular oscillator sync in here as well, which I'm sure sounds better on more traditional waveforms. So Morph is one way that Modwave extends wavetable synthesis. The second type of wavetable mangler in Modwave is called a modifier. Now, unlike Morph, which processes the wavetable in real time, a modifier applies a one-time offline process to a wavetable the minute you choose it. There's no direct button for modifiers. They're on the first page of the oscillator section. You can see modifier over here, and these will change the waveform by leaving only odd harmonics, even does the same for the even harmonics, and obviously we won't go through each and every one of these. Vintage is a nice low bitrate effect type. The soft and hard clip ones also work well, and there are various EQ style options, increase gain, reduce gain. Now, I hear you say that's nice, but what if I wanted to apply gradual clipping as opposed to an all or nothing situation? And that's where, among other, the waveform AB option comes in. This basically gives you two different wavetables per oscillator. They're somewhat linked. So let's say if I choose the, let's go for hard clip for wavetable A and then click here to add wavetable B into the mix. So basically A is just one wavetable. I think it's a simplified way of treating wavetables, and AB is when you're willing to graduate to blending wavetables. And let's choose basic 1 here. So now we basically have the identical waveforms, both for wavetable A and for B, and then we can go ahead and blend between the two. Now this is a relatively subtle transition. Anyway, morph and position work on both tables, A and B. And I could have put a completely different wavetable in wavetable B had I wanted. So in general, A and B are linked to each other. However, you can, if you want, introduce an offset for wavetable B. So those are the wavetable functions of both of the oscillators. You've got two of them. And then the third function for each of the oscillators is the sample mode. Now this is a simpler playback mode. Position doesn't do anything. AB blend doesn't do anything. Morph doesn't do anything. And you can just choose between, like I mentioned, 2 gigabytes of samples. And there are quite a few of these. You can sort them, by the way, by category or collection. So if I go ahead and hit Shift category, I can just choose bass, leads, and so on. Let's maybe go for the acoustic pianos. I can now go through these. And yeah, these samples are in stereo, which is cool. So those are more or less the individual oscillators. You can also cross-mod oscillator 1 and 2. So up until now, we've just been hearing oscillator 1. If I bring in oscillator 2 and reduce oscillator 1, this is our oscillator 2. And it has a few morph options that oscillator 1 doesn't have. And these are, if we double tap shift, ring mod, amplitude modulation, and FM. FM is the coolest. So now morph becomes a mod amount for FM. Now this sounds a little buzzy because, as is the case with FM, both the frequency and wave shape of the modulator, oscillator 1, matters. So if I head out to oscillator 1 and change it from a saw to a sine wave, things will get a lot better. And yeah, this is the FM I was looking for. Now all this moving of morph knobs manually is tiring me. Luckily, the oscillators have both dedicated envelopes and dedicated LFOs. The LFOs are dedicated to the morph function, and the oscillators are dedicated to position. By default, obviously, you can modulate anything with anything here. So if I didn't want to modulate this myself, all I'd need to do is to go into the LFO and increase the LFO mod depth. and I would get that motion automatically, which you can't see here, by the way, on the waveform, but you can see on this scope or my scope. Anyway, cool stuff. So those are our core oscillators. We also have a third simple sub-oscillator or noise generator. And there are a few types. Again, with Shift, we can change through the types. Yeah, straightforward stuff here as well. While we're on this page, each oscillator can be panned separately. Okay, so that's pretty much everything you need to know about the oscillator section in Modwave. Since the filter envelopes, LFOs and effects are more or less similar to Wavestate, I'll cover them briefly later. Let's cover the two other main differences between this and Wavestate, the motion sequencer and Kaoss physics. The most important thing you want to know about the sequencer is to be in sequencing mode and not in set list mode. Otherwise, if you touch these buttons, you'll be changing presets. Go into sequencer steps, and then a shift or double tap chooses any one of the 7 lanes, and a regular click will edit a step in each of the lanes. There are 64 steps in a sequence. If you want to reach steps beyond 16, you have to go into different banks, which you can with a double tap or a shift tap. Sequencer view, double tap gives you a bird's eye view into the sequence. So you can see how each of the lanes moves forwards or backwards or any way you set it. And you notice the sequencer starts every time you hit a note. Now you can either enter values one by one or motion sequence into lanes A through D. Let's start, say, with pitch. Double tap pitch to go into the pitch lane. And I want to keep this short. Let's go for 4 steps for the pitch lane. You can see that change here. And then say go into step 1 and maybe transpose that 5 semitones up, and sequence is running all the time. So that's step 1 and step 2. Let's go to step 3, transpose that down, say 7 semitones. And we now have a repeating sequence. We can always view this in sequence view. Those are my 4 steps. Now the sequencer isn't like most sequencers where you just input a pattern and it runs on its own. Rather, as you can hear and see, it's a sequence that starts, a pattern that starts every time I hit a note. If I hit multiple notes at the same time, it'll run together. If I hit them one after another, this can happen. They each run completely independently. So the sequencer isn't polyphonic in the sense of pitch, but it is polyphonic in terms of that it runs individually for every note or every voice you activate. If you want the notes to be in sync, by the way, you hit Shift Sync Notes on, and they'll always be in sync. Let's edit the timing lane. Timing applies to all the steps. That's sort of like the master track that determines how the steps move forward. Let's just set it to 2 steps, and then go ahead and look at steps A and A1 and A2. Let's change A1 maybe to, let's go for this to change the rhythm. So I've now created a 2-step pattern in terms of the timing lane, but a 4-step pattern in terms of the pitch lane. And this is how the two interact. Let's maybe make this more extreme. That's how the two interplay together. You can view this here and on screen if you've got the software connected. There are a few other lane parameters you can change. So for example, let's go for how it plays. So right now, the pitch lane is moving forward, but I could change that to move back and forth, or move in reverse, or just play randomly. And another cool feature here, you can choose to quantize the pitch lane to a particular scale if you like. And there are a bunch of options here. Let's move on to the other lane types. I'll talk about shape in a bit. A through D are just regular old sequencing lanes. So let's say that I wanted to modulate the filter cutoff to automate this motion. I'd go into lane A. I could set any length I want, and I could, of course, do this manually, but nobody got time for that. You can just hit record and then choose to either automate pitch. This lets you step sequence or enter pitches, or choose one of the motion sequencing lanes, in which case the handy dandy on-screen help tells you what you need to do. Hold a note and start recording whichever parameter you want to automate. In this case, it's the filter cutoff. And I've just created an automation. And you can see this on screen in the companion software. Unfortunately, you can't see the values, the automation values on screen here, at least not in the current firmware. Anyway, you can automate up to 4 parameters directly using the knobs, and of course, send this automation information anywhere you want. So what's the deal with the shape plane? Double tap this, set it to any length you like. I can make it shorter. Just for the case of this demo, let's make it 4 steps as well. Anyway, what you do with the shape steps is set an envelope shape, if you want, on a per step basis. And these are all the different envelope shapes that you can choose from. So a nice selection here. Now, unfortunately, at least as of the current firmware, you can't just assign this to any parameter. You have to assign it to a sequencing lane, which is assigned to a parameter. Don't ask me why. I hope they change that. To save us time, I created a preset that does just that. Here we go. Shape to noise. So what do we have here? A quick look at the sequencer view, and the screen will show you the exact shapes on a per step basis. And I've pointed shape to sequence A and sequence A to the level of the noise generator. So I could now go ahead into the shape lane and look at the different shapes that I'm using. That's what's making these ratchets. So I could cancel them out if I wanted. All on just makes noise, but as I choose interesting shapes, I can get interesting rhythmic results. So that's the shape sequencer. So those are motion sequencing basics. To wrap up the sequencer discussion, I'll take a look at a few miscellaneous functions, not all of them. We talked about sync notes. The master lane lets you reset all the lanes after a certain time or number of steps. So if you've got multiple polymetric or different length lanes and you want to sort of have them get back in order at some point, double-click master lane, turn that on, and then set a duration where everything starts to repeat. You can do that over here, and this can be time-based or tempo-based, so say 2 seconds. Each of the lanes has a utility page. If I go into the pages, you can cut steps, copy, clear, and there are a few step parameters. If you hit into a step, these are a few randomization options, and you can either have smooth transitions between steps or just have abrupt changes. This does support probabilities up to 100%, simple probabilities. And while overall, all the changes that happen within a sequence happen within the context of a filter envelope, a single filter envelope, or a single amp envelope, so this is a single sound, you can choose to re-trigger envelopes every pulse or every step. This doesn't trigger separate voices on a per sequencer step basis, but you can re-trigger the envelopes for each step if you want. So that's the sequencer. Let's talk about Kaoss physics. I'll go into an init preset. Now, to understand how this works, let's briefly travel into the mod matrix and understand how to map stuff to it, because this doesn't do anything unless you map it to something. Setting up mod slots is actually very easy. Mod handles the mod matrix, and to add a new mod slot, you hit mod and page plus. That's pretty much the hardest thing about it, because there's help for every step along the way. So let's say that I wanted Kaoss X to move the filter cutoff. I would just turn the filter cutoff knob and I just set a destination. And then let's go for source Kaoss X and hit enter. We just made the connection. Set a mod depth, and we've just now set a connection between Kaoss X and the filter cutoff. So that's one way of making a connection. Another way is by first selecting a parameter. So let's say that I wanted to control the sub-oscillator level with Kaoss Y. So I'd select that parameter, then again mod page plus to add a mod slot to the matrix. And then instead of turning the knob, presumably we do this with parameters that don't have knobs connected to them, just hit enter, and you can see our destination is sub/noise level, and we want to go for Kaoss Y, hit enter, and set a depth, and Kaoss Y now controls our sub oscillator, Kaoss X, our filter. Intensity, by the way, lets you add a controller. So I could say have the mod wheel control the mod depth of the y-axis, but let's not do that for now. If you're using the software, by the way, you just click a mod destination and then add sources to it. You can't see a list of mod destinations neither here or in the software. You also can't see all the mod matrix in the software, at least not currently. You can, however, using the controller, you can page through the different modulation parent pages using page up and down, and then enter will let you look at the different mod slots. We currently have 2 mod slots. Okay, great. So now we know how the mod matrix works. Let's go back to the Kaoss physics. So we didn't go through all this trouble just to use this as an XY controller, but rather to start throwing this ball around. Now, if it just bounces back and forth, it just becomes another LFO, which isn't very interesting. But there are a few parameters we can mess with here. For example, we can tilt the whole board in one direction, and notice how it's bouncing off the edges. We'll talk about that in a bit. And we can increase friction, so make it harder for the ball to bounce around because it stops. And one of the more interesting things is introduce a bump. Now, bumps can either go up, in which case they're white, or notice how it pushed the ball out, or be below the surface, in which case the ball will fall into their center. And then notice how the ball bounces off the edges. If you want, you can cancel that, and then it'll just pass through the edges, and you can set it so that the walls either accelerate or decelerate the ball. So let's go for an extreme pinball style acceleration. Every time I hit the bottom, notice it goes faster. And yeah, the other sides, I could have them, the top say, slow down the ball. And then since it's no fun to flick the ball like this for every note, I can go into the last page and trigger the ball. Let's go for a gate plus damper. So now every time I hit a note, the ball will start moving with a certain force in a certain direction, so let's say give it more force. Now it takes a bit of experimentation to get to the right settings. To save us some time, I created a preset with an organic motion that I liked, along with some effects. Cool. So it's kind of like an envelope, but it becomes an evolving timbre that I think sounds very natural. There are a few presets in here that you can explore. Let's maybe go for time travel. Kind of like an organic LFO, I think. Or try maybe one more. Let's go for... yeah, the bump is moving around here. Yeah, just a way to get organic sounds. That maybe just don't sound like stale envelopes or LFOs. Okay, so we covered the main things that are new in Modwave, mostly compared to Wavestate, which I think is its closest comparable synth. I'll briefly cover the things that are similar. Moving on down the signal chain, from the oscillators is the filter. There are a few filter types. Poly 6 style filter. MS-20, Raspier, By the way, since there are quite a few gain options and obviously oscillators in here, there are a few trim and gain control options, which, control how the oscillators are fed into the filter. Anyway, that's Poly 6, and the MS-20 filter. M filter lets you crossfade between two filter types, and you can choose from quite a long list of filter types, and more just gives you access to these three, plus a few other options. There are a bunch of filter tracking options, and there's a filter envelope and filter LFO, which are connected directly to the filter, so you don't need to mess with the mod matrix. Speaking of envelopes, so you've got 4 of them, 2 that go into the oscillator, remember position, and 1 that goes into the filter, another into level or amplitude. Yeah, simple attack, decay, sustain envelope with a sustain that can go below 0, which is a nice touch. And if you want, you can also set the curve for each of these slopes with shift. And like I mentioned earlier, one neat feature of all the envelopes is that you can set to trigger them based on steps in the sequencer, or really any one of a number of different sources. I didn't mention this earlier. These are the controllers, but you can go ahead and choose the mod knobs, the generators, and regular old MIDI CCs, whether unipolar or bipolar. So those are the 4 envelopes, again, routable to anywhere through the mod matrix. Let's move on to the LFOs. 5 LFOs, 2 going into oscillator morph, we talked about that, and then 3 going by default into the filter, level, amplitude, or pitch. These do have intensity control for their direct mappings here. So, filter LFO, and these can be time synced or not. And there's a curve option, which you don't see a visualization here. You do in the software, by the way. It would be nice if they'd show that here. And there are a bunch of shapes. Including a few random options. Let's maybe set this to something simple. The LFOs, by the way, are polyphonic, which means that by default they won't be in sync as you play additional notes, unless you want them to. Let's move on and talk about the effects. They're pretty similar to Wavestate. You get different layer effects for each of the layers, and master, reverb, and EQ. You activate them with a double tap, and then choose ascend, and additional parameters using shift. So time, timbre, and size. And there's also a master EQ, pretty straightforward, and then delay. It's always nice. With a few delay types. Tape, echo, left, center, right. Let's stick with a, you know what, let's cancel this. Mod effects. Each of these, by the way, has presets. So aside from the delay type, you've got a preset for each of the types. So that's the delay. Modulation effects. Let's turn it on. Maybe we'll hear that better without the LFO. that's the chorus. Let's try a few other mod types. Phaser, flanger, wah. So those are the mod effects, and the pre-effects are pretty cool. Anything from a compressor, again with different presets. And maybe go into my favorite, the Waveshaper. And then the final big and fun function is the randomization, which has its own scope level. So I could choose to, maybe just randomize the oscillator. Don't know what I'm going to get, but let's go for it. Oops. Enter to confirm. So not much. Let's be more aggressive. Hang on. Let's randomize the entire performance. Let's go for it. Performance. Extreme settings. Execute. Are you sure? Yes. Let's see what we get. Fairly interesting. Let's do that again. And the interesting thing is, if you look on screen, you'll see all the values change as well. Now, you never know what you're going to get. This is completely and crazily random, so you might need to try this a few times. But it might get you going in an interesting direction. Before we head out to the pros and cons, let's just cover a few miscellaneous items. If I tab through the performance menu, let's see what we get here. Level per layer and velocity zones. So you can have different layers trigger based on different velocities. Keyboard zones, create splits, and crossfade between the splits. And let's see if there's anything interesting here. Unison. So if you want to stack voices, you can do that here with detune and analog style thickness. And I think that's pretty much it. Microtonal tuning, if you like. And what else didn't I cover? In the mod matrix, you've got two mod processors. These, like in Wavestate, are for more complex processing of one or more mod sources. So you can, for example, sum two sources or multiply them with scale, quantize them, so sort of like a sample and hold, or smoothen them out, kind of like a slew limiter. Okay, so that's it for Modwave details. Let's talk about the pros and cons. I'll start with the cons, and I typically split these up to hardware cons, which won't change, and software, which might be upgraded in a future firmware update. On the hardware side, this is a polysynth with only 3 octaves, obviously extra keys and aftertouch, which this doesn't have, would cost more, but if you're a performing musician, 3 octaves is a bit tight, especially if you create layer splits. Aside from that, the screen is pretty small. For some parameter pages, it's actually pretty easy to edit the parameters, like these, for example, but others tend to be a bit garbled and you sort of need to jump around between different parameters. There aren't many of these, but there are some, so you need to be aware of that. Aside from that, while Modwave can play back samples, it cannot sample, nor can you load in your own samples currently, though you can load up user wavetables. Hopefully, a future firmware update will add the ability to load up your own samples into this, which would be really cool. On the firmware or software side, I would really like to see a situation where you have some sort of visual indication of all the mod routings and sequencer values. Yes, you can page through the mod matrix step by step or press the sequencer steps individually, but nothing beats seeing everything in a single glance like you can on the software editor. Now this does have a graphic screen, so hopefully one day those things will find their way into here. Also, I noticed that it's pretty easy to have harsh clipping at high volume levels when you have a lot going on, not in all cases. So just be attentive if it happens to you, just lower the levels. And those are pretty much my cons. On the pros side, I have to say that for the sheer number of features on Modwave, the user interface makes a lot of sense and is very fast and usable in many cases. Having the librarian and editor software around is a great way to get acquainted with the instrument, and once you are, for the most part, you can part ways and get to almost anything pretty quickly on the instrument itself. The combination of samples and wavetables, filters are pretty good in my opinion. A big library of factory content, multiple effects, and even a bit of cross oscillator FM makes this a very sonically diverse instrument out of the box. On the modulation side, I think that the Kaoss physics is a really unique feature and can be a true organic mod source if set up properly, and motion sequencing 2.0, meaning that each of the 7 lanes has its own length and direction, is a great creative sequencing tool. That plus the many modulation sources and even more modulation destinations in here, just the mod matrix alone can keep you exploring ideas with all these sound sources and filters and envelopes for quite a while. And if you're out of ideas on what to do with all these mod sources and destinations, check out my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.